The clock on the nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m. when I heard his footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my ear to the bedroom door, counting each creak of the floorboards. This was it. Tonight, I would either escape or die trying. My name doesn't matter now, but what matters is that I survived. At 17, I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I grabbed the backpack I'd hidden under my bed for months, took one last look at the room that had been my prison for 5 years, and climbed out the window into the Colorado night. The air was sharp against my skin, cutting through the thin jacket I wore. My bare feet hit the frozen ground, but I couldn't feel the cold anymore. Fear had numbed everything except my desperate need to run. Behind me, the house stood dark and silent, harboring secrets that had nearly destroyed me. Uncle Marcus thought he owned me, thought his threats and violence had broken my spirit completely. He was wrong. As I ran down the empty street, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, I whispered a promise to myself that I would never be a victim again. My story begins not with that midnight escape, but 5 years earlier, when I was 12 and my world collapsed in a single phone call. I was sitting in our kitchen in Denver, helping my mother prepare dinner, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was clinical, detached, informing us that my father had been killed in a construction accident. The words seemed to echo in a void, meaningless at first, then crashing into reality like a freight train. My mother's scream pierced the evening air, and I watched her crumble to the linoleum floor, her dreams shattering around her like broken glass. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of grief and uncertainty. Medical bills consumed our savings, and my mother's depression deepened with each passing day. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped living in any meaningful way. I tried to hold our small family together, cooking simple meals and keeping up with school, but I was just a child carrying an adult's burden. When the eviction notice came, my mother made a phone call that would haunt me for years to come. Uncle Marcus, her brother, lived in Colorado Springs with his wife Linda. They had a big house, he said, plenty of room for us to start over. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of these early moments, please leave the word survivor in the comments below. Your support means everything to me as I share this difficult journey. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to hear how this story of escape and redemption continues to unfold. The drive to Colorado Springs felt like traveling to another planet. Uncle Marcus met us at his front door, all smiles and reassuring words about family sticking together. He was a large man, well over 6 feet, with calloused hands and a voice that commanded attention. His house was impressive, a 2-story colonial, with a perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence. It looked like the American dream from the outside. But I felt something cold settle in my stomach the moment I crossed the threshold. Linda, his wife, was quiet and nervous, constantly smoothing her hair and avoiding direct eye contact. She showed us to our rooms with quick, efficient movements, as if she wanted to complete the task and disappear. My mother was given the guest room on the main floor, while I was assigned a small bedroom in the basement. The room smelled of dampness and old carpet, with a single window near the ceiling that barely let in any light. That first night, lying on a narrow bed that creaked with every movement, I stared at the water stains on the ceiling and tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that we would rebuild our lives and move on. The first few weeks seemed normal enough. Uncle Marcus was attentive to my mother, bringing her tea and speaking in gentle tones about healing and moving forward. He helped me enroll in the local middle school and even drove me to my first day, offering fatherly advice about making new friends and working hard. But I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. The way his eyes lingered on me when he thought no one was looking. How he found excuses to touch my shoulder or ruffle my hair. The inappropriate comments disguised as harmless jokes that made Linda flinch and look away. My mother, lost in her own world of grief and medication, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in the house. She spent most days in her room, emerging only for meals that she barely touched. I tried to tell her about Uncle Marcus's behavior, but she dismissed my concerns as adjustment difficulties. "You're just not used to having a man around the house," she would say, not understanding that I was trying to warn her about something much darker than my discomfort with change. The first time Uncle Marcus hit me, I was 13 and had forgotten to take out the trash before school. I came home to find him waiting in the kitchen, his face red with anger. The blow came without warning, an open-handed slap that sent me stumbling backward into the counter. My cheek burned, and tears sprang to my eyes. But it was the look in his eyes that terrified me most. There was a cold satisfaction there, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to cross that line. When my mother asked about the bruise at dinner, he smoothly explained that I had fallen off my bike, and she accepted the lie without question. That night, lying in my basement room, with my cheeks still throbbing, I realized that no one was coming to save me. Uncle Marcus had positioned himself as our savior, the generous brother who had taken in his grieving sister and her troubled daughter. Any accusations I made would sound like the lies of an ungrateful child acting out. I was trapped in a house with a predator, and the one person who should have protected me was too broken to see the danger. This is just the beginning of my story, and I want you to know that what's coming next will test every limit of human endurance. But please, stay with me, because this story has a powerful ending that you won't want to miss. If you're finding strength in this journey, please hit that subscribe button now. The abuse escalated gradually, like a slowly turning screw that tightened with each passing month. Uncle Marcus was careful never to leave marks where they would be visible at school, and his timing was calculated to avoid Linda's presence. My aunt had begun working longer hours at the local hospital, and I suspected she was deliberately avoiding being home. The basement became my prison, and Uncle Marcus held all the keys. He installed a lock on the outside of my door, claiming it was for security. But I knew it was to control my movements. That school became my only refuge, but even there, I felt isolated and different. The other kids seemed to exist in a world of normal teenage problems, worrying about homework and crushes, while I carried the weight of abuse and fear. I threw myself into my studies with desperate intensity, earning straight A's not out of ambition, but from a desperate need to prove my worth and perhaps earn my way out of that house. My teachers praised my dedication, never suspecting that I was clinging to academic success like a lifeline in a storm. The physical abuse was terrible, but it was the psychological warfare that nearly broke me. Uncle Marcus was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to destroy a young person's sense of self-worth. He would praise me one moment and tear me down the next, creating a confusing cycle of hope and despair that left me questioning my own reality. He told me repeatedly that no one would believe me if I spoke out, that I was damaged goods that no one else would want, that my mother's fragile mental state meant any disruption would probably kill her. By the time I turned 15, my mother had become a ghost in her own life. She rarely left her room except for doctor appointments and brief trips to the grocery store. The medication she was taking for her depression seemed to fog her mind, making her even less aware of what was happening around her. I watched her disappear a little more each day and felt my own hope fading with her. Uncle Marcus's control over both of us was complete, and he reveled in his power like a king surveying his domain. It was during my sophomore year that I first learned about military service. Our history teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had invited a recruiter to speak to our class about opportunities in the armed forces. As the sergeant talked about discipline, purpose, and serving something greater than yourself, I felt something stir inside me that I had thought was dead. Here was a path that could lead away from the house of horrors, a way to transform my pain into strength. After class, I approached the recruiter with questions, careful to sound casual and merely curious. The idea of military service became my secret obsession. I researched every branch, every job specialty, every requirement for enlistment. I learned that I could enlist at 17 with parental consent, and began formulating a plan that seemed impossible but was my only hope for escape. I knew Uncle Marcus would never willingly sign the papers, and my mother was in no condition to make such a decision. But I also knew that desperate times called for desperate measures, and I was running out of time. Uncle Marcus's behavior was becoming more erratic and dangerous. Linda had started working double shifts, and I suspected she knew more than she was willing to admit about what went on in her absence. The basement had become a place of unspeakable horrors, and I felt myself fragmenting under the constant stress and fear. Sleep became elusive, and I would lie awake, planning my escape, going over every detail until I had memorized every step of my plan. The breaking point came on a cold February night when I was 16. Uncle Marcus had been drinking heavily, and the sounds of his footsteps on the basement stairs filled me with familiar dread. But that night was different somehow. As he unlocked my door and stepped into the room with that predatory smile, something inside me snapped. I was no longer the terrified 12-year-old who had arrived at his house. I had grown stronger, both physically and mentally, and I refused to be his victim any longer. I fought back that night with a fury that surprised us both. When Uncle Marcus raised his hand to strike me, I caught his wrist and held it, staring into his eyes with a rage that made him step back. I told him in a voice I barely recognized that if he ever touched me again, I would kill him. The words hung in the air between us like a declaration of war, and we both knew that something fundamental had changed. He left my room without another word, but I knew that this escalation meant my time was running out. For weeks after that confrontation, the house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Uncle Marcus watched me with calculating eyes, and I could see him plotting his next move. Linda seemed more nervous than ever, jumping at sudden sounds and avoiding eye contact with everyone. My mother continued her slow fade from reality, unaware that a battle for my survival was being waged around her. I knew that I had to act soon, before Uncle Marcus decided to permanently silence the threat I represented. The final piece of my escape plan fell into place when I discovered that Linda kept important documents in a filing cabinet in the home office. During one of her long shifts at the hospital, I managed to pick the simple lock and found what I was looking for: my mother's signature on various documents, which I practiced copying until I could replicate it perfectly. I also found my birth certificate and social security card, documents I would need for my new life. The forgery was risky, but I was past the point of caring about legal niceties. My 17th birthday came and went without celebration. Just another day in a house where joy went to die. But internally, I was counting down to something much more significant than another year of life. I had set my escape date for March 15th, a date I had chosen because Uncle Marcus would be away on a business trip, leaving me with just Linda and my mother to deal with. I had already made contact with a recruiter through carefully coded emails sent from the school library, and he was prepared to process my enlistment papers as soon as I could get to his office. The night before my planned escape, I lay in my basement room going over every detail of my plan one final time. I had packed a small backpack with essential items: my identification documents, the forged consent forms, a change of clothes, and what little money I had managed to save from the small allowance Uncle Marcus occasionally gave me. The backpack was hidden in the basement crawl space, along with a flashlight and the tools I would need to remove the window screen. My heart pounded as I imagined walking out of that house forever, never to return. That last night, Uncle Marcus came to my room one final time. He seemed different somehow, more agitated than usual, and I wondered if he sensed what was coming. He stood in my doorway for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to read my thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warning that chilled me to the bone. "Tomorrow, we're going to have a serious talk about your future," he said, and I knew that my window for escape was closing rapidly. Whatever he had planned for me, I would not be there to find out. At 11:47 p.m., I heard his bedroom door close for the final time. I waited another hour, listening to the sounds of the house settling into sleep, before I began my escape. Moving, with the stealth I had learned from years of trying to avoid his attention, I retrieved my backpack and made my way to the basement window. The screen came off easily, and the cold March air hit my face like a baptism into freedom. I squeezed through the narrow opening and found myself standing on the frozen ground outside. Finally free, but with nowhere to go. The first few days of freedom were a blur of fear, hunger, and uncertainty. I slept in a bus station restroom the first night, curled up on the cold tile floor with my backpack as a pillow. The next morning, I made my way to the Army recruitment office, my forged documents clutched in my trembling hands. The recruiter, Sergeant Martinez, looked at me with kind eyes and asked if I was sure about this decision. I told him with more conviction than I had ever felt about anything that military service was not just what I wanted, it was what I needed to survive. The processing happened quickly. Perhaps because I was so obviously desperate to escape whatever situation had brought me to that office. Within a week, I was on a bus heading to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for basic training. As the Colorado landscape disappeared behind me, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that I will never forget. I was leaving behind everything I had ever known, including a mother who might never understand why I had to go. But I was also heading toward a future where I would never again be anyone's victim. Basic training was brutal, but after years of psychological and physical abuse, the challenges felt almost manageable. The drill sergeants were tough, but they were tough for a purpose: to make us stronger and more capable. For the first time in my life, I was being pushed to my limits by people who wanted me to succeed, not to break. I thrived in the structured environment, excelling in physical fitness and weapons training while struggling more with the social aspects of military life. I had spent so many years isolated and afraid that learning to trust and work with others was my greatest challenge. My fellow recruits came from all walks of life, but most had never experienced anything like the hell I had escaped. Their complaints about military life seemed almost quaint to me, and I found myself becoming a leader among them, someone others looked to for strength and determination. When they asked about my family, I kept my answers vague, simply saying that I was better off on my own. The truth was too dark and complicated for casual conversation, and I was not ready to trust anyone with my story. The transformation from victim to soldier was gradual, but profound. Each week of training stripped away more of the frightened girl I had been and replaced her with someone stronger and more confident. I learned to shoot, to fight, to survive in hostile environments. But more importantly, I learned that I had value, that my life had meaning beyond serving as someone else's punching bag. The army gave me what Uncle Marcus had tried to destroy: self-respect and a sense of purpose. After graduation from basic training, I was assigned to Fort Campbell in Kentucky as a military police officer. The irony was not lost on me that someone who had never been able to turn to law enforcement for help was now wearing the badge and uniform of military law enforcement. But I threw myself into my new role with the same intensity I had brought to basic training, determined to be the kind of protector I had never had. My first few years in the Army passed in a blur of training, deployments, and gradual healing. I was promoted quickly, earning recognition for my dedication and leadership abilities. But the trauma of my past was always there, lurking beneath the surface of my new life. I had nightmares that left me gasping and sweating in my barracks bed. Unexpected sounds could send me into a panic attack that I had to hide from my fellow soldiers. I was functioning, even succeeding, but I was not yet whole. It was during my second deployment to Afghanistan that I began to truly understand what I was capable of. The chaos and danger of a combat zone somehow felt less threatening than the house I had grown up in. Here, the enemies were clearly defined, and I had weapons and training to defend myself. I distinguished myself in several engagements, earning commendations and the respect of my unit. For the first time in my life, I felt truly powerful, truly in control of my own destiny. When one returned from deployment, I had been promoted to staff sergeant and was being considered for officer training. The scared teenager who had crawled through a basement window seemed like a different person entirely. I had found my calling in military service and was building a career that gave me both financial security and personal satisfaction. But there was still one ghost from my past that I had never confronted, and I knew that eventually I would have to face it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 years after my midnight escape. My commanding officer informed me that my mother had died of a heart attack, alone in her room in Uncle Marcus's house. The news hit me like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of guilt and regret that I had been holding at bay for years. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and I had abandoned her to die in that house of horrors while I built my new life thousands of miles away. I requested emergency leave to attend the funeral, my first return to Colorado since the night I had fled. The drive from the airport to Colorado Springs felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark bringing back memories I had tried to bury. When I pulled up to Uncle Marcus's house, now wearing my dress uniform with sergeant's stripes and combat ribbons, I felt like I was arriving as a completely different person than the one who had left. The funeral was a small affair, attended mostly by Linda's co-workers and a few distant relatives I barely remembered. Uncle Marcus stood at the graveside looking older and somehow diminished, no longer the imposing figure who had terrorized my youth. When he saw me in my uniform, something flickered in his eyes that might have been fear or recognition that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. We spoke briefly, stilted pleasantries that couldn't begin to address the years of abuse and abandonment between us. After the service, Linda approached me hesitantly, her eyes filled with a shame I recognized all too well. She told me things I had suspected but never had confirmed, that she had known about the abuse, that she had been too afraid to intervene, that leaving me alone with Marcus had haunted her every day. Her confession brought me no satisfaction, only a sad understanding of how fear can make cowards of us all. She begged for my forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to give it. Not yet. That evening, Uncle Marcus asked to speak with me privately. We sat in his living room, the same room where my mother had slowly faded from reality while he controlled and terrorized me. But now I sat across from him as an equal, a trained soldier with the confidence and authority that comes from years of military service. When he began to speak, it was clear that he was trying to rewrite history, to present himself as a man who had done his best in a difficult situation. I let him talk for a while, listening to his revisionist account of my childhood with a mixture of amazement and disgust. When he finished, I told him calmly and clearly exactly what he had done to me, using the same matter-of-fact tone I would use to give a military briefing. I watched his face change as I recounted specific incidents, dates, and details that made it impossible for him to deny or minimize his crimes. For the first time in our relationship, I held all the power. Then I told him about my life in the army, about the promotions and commendations, about the respect I had earned and the responsibility I carried. I explained that I was now part of a brotherhood that protected its own, that I had resources and connections he couldn't imagine. If I ever heard of him harming another child, if I ever had reason to believe he was continuing his predatory behavior, those resources would be brought to bear against him. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, and I could see that he understood. As I prepared to leave Colorado Springs, for what I knew would be the last time, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. I had faced my abuser as an equal and made it clear that his reign of terror was over. My mother was beyond his reach now, and I had the power to ensure that no other child would suffer as I had. The frightened girl who had crawled through a basement window was truly dead, replaced by a woman who would never again allow herself or others to be victimized. The years since that confrontation have been the best of my life. I completed officer training and rose through the ranks, eventually commanding my own unit and being recognized as one of the rising stars in my field. I found love with a fellow soldier who understood the demands of military life and the importance of strength in the face of adversity. We built a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. Everything my parents' marriage had never been. I also began speaking to groups about child abuse and the importance of military service as a path to transformation and healing. My story resonated with many young people who felt trapped in their own situations, and I was able to help several of them find their way into military careers that changed their lives. Each person I helped felt like a victory over Uncle Marcus and everything he represented. Looking back now, I can see that my midnight escape was not just a flight from danger, but the beginning of a journey toward becoming the person I was meant to be. The military gave me structure, purpose, and the tools to transform my pain into strength. Every promotion, every commendation, every life I've been able to touch has been a testament to the power of refusing to remain a victim. If this story has moved you, or if you've found strength in the journey from victim to survivor to victor, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what part of this story resonated most with you? Your engagement and support mean the world to me. And if you'd like to hear more stories of courage, transformation, and triumph over adversity, please subscribe to this channel. Together, we can inspire others to find their own path to freedom and strength.